Okay, let's unpack this. Few names conjure up images of doom, destiny, and, well, predetermined world events, quite like Nostradamus. And we are talking about a figure whose reputation hasn't just survived for centuries, it seems to almost gather momentum, doesn't it? Accelerating with every global tragedy or big historical shift. Seriously, if you just look at the pop culture stuff around him, he gets credit for predicting, well, everything. The rise of Hitler and Napoleon, the Great Fire of London, even the September 11th attacks. The man's cultural footprint is just huge. It really defines how a lot of people think about prophecy itself. So our mission today is to take a deep dive into the actual source material. We want to bypass the sensational myths that Hollywood and the bestseller lists absolutely love and really understand the history. We want to figure out who Michel de Nostradamus actually was, how he put together his famous prophecies using the sources he had, and why, centuries later, we're all still so invested in debating whether he got things right. We're going to structure this, starting with the man himself. His surprisingly practical professional life as a 16th century physician. Then we'll get into the mechanics, the deliberate way he compiled his prophetic books. And finally, we'll apply some, modern academic rigor to his enduring, but maybe often misunderstood legacy.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that the image most people have, the guy in a cloak staring into flames, it's completely overshadowed by the reality. The reality of a pretty savvy, ambitious, and sometimes struggling 16th century physician, Michel de Nostradamus, born in Sarreguemines-de-Provence, 1503. And to really get him, you have to start with his family background. His father's side, they were originally Jewish. His grandfather, Cresqua, was quite notable, a grain and money dealer in Avignon. He converted to Catholicism around 1459 or 1460. And this conversion, it wasn't just about religion. It was really a socioeconomic necessity back then. It let the family properly assimilate into Christian French society. When Cresqua converted, he took the Christian name Pierre and the surname Nostradamus, Our Lady. This background is pretty crucial, I think. He came from a line that understood religious change, social shifts, and the need for, pragmatic adaptation.
Right, that immediately gives us a much more grounded figure, doesn't it? Not some mystical outsider, but someone shaped by the complex realities of the late Renaissance. So let's talk about his education. You said it sounded like it was anything but stable.
Oh, it was turbulent, definitely. He was pretty young, maybe 14, when he entered the University of Avignon. He spent just over a year there, starting his baccalaureate, focusing on the standard stuff, the trivium. Yeah, grammar, rhetoric, logic, the core verbal arts, basically. But his studies got cut short. Abruptly, the university had to close because of a really bad plague outbreak.
Wow, so his formal academic start was basically stopped by the very disease that later kind of defined his professional success. That's quite an irony.
It really is. After he left Avignon around 1521, he then spent the next 8 years traveling the countryside, not as some scholar, but as a working apothecary.
Right, hands-on.
Exactly. Researching, getting hands-on knowledge of herbal remedies, practical medicine. This period gave him invaluable direct experience, but it also caused problems for him later, professionally. See, he tried to legitimize that practical knowledge later on. He entered the University of Montpellier in 1529, aiming for a medical doctorate, but his time there was incredibly short, maybe weeks, maybe months. He got expelled almost immediately by the student procurator, Guillaume Rondelet, who later became a big name in French anatomy, by the way.
Expelled? Why?
The reason was specific and professional. He had been an apothecary, and being an apothecary was considered a manual trade, which was explicitly banned by the university statutes. They prioritized intellectual, theoretical learning over, hands-on work.
Wait, so the university rules saw his actual real-world experience making medicine as a negative? That sounds like, some serious 16th century intellectual snobbery.
Absolutely. The medical establishment back then really wanted to keep this rigid line between the learned doctor who diagnosed and the tradesman apothecary who just mixed the cures. And to make matters worse, the expulsion document, it actually still survives. It notes he'd also been slandering doctors. Given his 8 years of practical work, he probably didn't think much of the theoretical, sometimes pretty useless treatments that the university-trained physicians were prescribing.
That is fantastic detail. Yet, okay, so he gets kicked out for being a practical guy who criticized the establishment. But later on, some publishers and people writing to him called him doctor. Was that just him adopting a title to boost his image?
It seems highly probable, yeah. It's kind of an early example of his personal branding, getting ahead of his verifiable qualifications. But to be fair, his fame was cemented by genuine professional success, against the very plague, actually, that killed his grandfather and interrupted his education. He got famous for creating something called the rose pill.
Rose pill.
Yeah, a lozenge or troche, made from cypress shavings, iris, cinnamon, and yes, roses. He claimed it protected against the plague. And his success as a healer seems genuine. He helped a prominent physician, Louis Seer, in Marseille. He tackled major outbreaks on his own in places like Salon-de-Provence and Aix-en-Provence, got praised, got paid. He was highly sought after.
But the plague, it gave him his professional reputation, but it also dealt him this absolutely crushing personal blow, didn't it?
Yes. Terrible tragedy struck in 1534. His first wife history unfortunately hasn't given us her name for sure, and their two young children all died in a plague outbreak.
Oh, no.
For a man who dedicated himself to fighting this very disease, that loss must have been just devastating. It perhaps prompted his later travels, maybe even a trip through Italy before he eventually got back to his healing work.
That kind of profound personal loss for a successful healer, it definitely adds layers to why he might have shifted focus later on. He was clearly a man of practical skill, deep personal pain, and, well, undeniable ambition. So when did he finally settle down again?
He came back around 1545, picked up his effective healing work again, and finally settled for good in Salon-de-Provence in 1547. He remarried a rich widow named Anne Ponsard. They had 6 children together, 3 sons, 3 daughters, and crucially, he really cemented his status as a successful local businessman, not just a healer. Between 1556 and 1567, he and his wife actually bought a share in the huge Canal de Cropon project. That was a massive effort to irrigate the dry local land using water from the Durance River.
Okay, so at this point, he's a respected physician, successful businessman, settled family man, community investor. This is the profile of a pretty upstanding 16th century citizen. How does this guy pivot to become the world's most famous prognosticator?
That shift started around 1550, and it began not with the famous quatrains, but with something much more practical, money-making annual publications, almanacs.
The almanac.
Exactly. Following a popular trend, he started Latinizing his name Nostradamus, became Nostradamus, and publishing these highly profitable annual almanacs. They had short predictions for the year ahead, and they were hugely successful. He published them constantly, sometimes 2 or 3 a year, right up until he died. This output eventually added up to, well, at least 6,338 prophecies, plus 11 annual calendars.
Wow, that sheer volume alone kind of explains why he might have needed shortcuts in existing sources, I guess we'll get to. But the success of these almanacs must have caught the eye of some powerful people.
Precisely. That success led directly to demands for specific horoscopes and, well, psychic advice from the wealthy and powerful. His most prominent client became Catherine de' Medici,
Queen.
the Queen, wife of King Henry II. She read his 1555 almanacs, which had these vaguely alarming hints about future threats to the royal family, and she summoned him to Paris. She wanted him to explain the verses, draw up horoscopes for her children. Apparently, he was initially quite scared when he got the summons, maybe worried about the Inquisition or political trouble. But by the time he died in 1566, Catherine had made him counselor and physician in ordinary to her son, King Charles IX. He'd successfully monetized his reputation.
Okay, but we need to note a really critical detail about his astrological process here, right? Because it kind of undermines the idea that he was this meticulous, professional astrologer looking for truth in the stars.
Absolutely. When he was doing these horoscopes, he generally expected his clients to provide their own birth charts, their nativities.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But when he had to calculate them himself using the published tables available then, researchers have found records showing he frequently made errors. Crucially, he often failed to adjust the figures for the client's exact place or time of birth. That's basically astrological malpractice.
So he wasn't that bothered about precision.
It suggests he was using astrology more as a narrative tool, a framework, rather than a rigorous scientific method.
Okay, so we have this ambitious, opportunistic, but successful physician/businessman. Now a successful almanac writer with a powerful royal patron. This brings us right to his magnum opus, Les Prophéties. Let's transition now to the actual structure and the intentional ambiguity of that really famous work.
Right. Les Prophéties. First published, starting in 1555. This is the book that really cemented his immortality. It's got 942 poetic quatrains, these 4-line verses, mostly in a very stylized French. And they're grouped into 10 centuries. 9 of these centuries have exactly 100 verses each. But the 7th century, oddly, only contains 42.
Only 42. What happened to the other 58?
that detail, the missing 58 from century 7, it's significant. Scholars generally suspect they were just lost or maybe removed because of some issue during the original printing. And we really have to stress how complex and unstable this text is just because of 16th century printing practices. No two editions printed by different shops were identical.
Right. Different spellings, punctuation.
Exactly. Which means the spellings, the punctuation, even the specific word choices. We can't reliably assume they're Nostradamus' originals. And that immediately complicates things for modern enthusiasts who try to find hidden codes or numerology based on, fixed spellings in the text.
The foundation for those theories is shaky from the start then.
It's built on sand, really.
And this sort of inherent obscurity was made worse by a layer of deliberate obfuscation by Nostradamus himself, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He's clearly worried about religious authorities, about being accused of heresy, or at least getting into political hot water.
Exactly right. His method, as he sort of described it, was to obscure the meaning so much that if challenged, he could claim it was just historical or cosmological speculation, not actual divine prophecy. He used what scholars call Virgilianized syntax.
Virgilianized. Like the poet Virgil.
Precisely. A really convoluted, complex phrasing that mirrors the manipulated word order Virgil used. It makes it very hard to figure out the subject, the verb, the object clearly. And on top of the syntax games, he threw in word games, puns, and strategically mixed languages. Greek, Italian, Latin, his local Provençal dialect. It was basically a self-protection strategy.
Making it cryptic enough for patrons like Catherine de' Medici to think it meant something specific, but vague enough to shield him from the Inquisition.
That's the idea. Layered meaning, plausible deniability.
So if he was deliberately making his prophecies obscure for safety, where was he actually getting the material for thousands of these verses? Was he genuinely having visions, or was he more like a research librarian?
The evidence points overwhelmingly towards the second option. Synthesis and paraphrasing. Using historical precedent, using texts that were already circulating, not supernatural visions. You can identify about 3 main source types. First, he relied on judicial astrology.
Okay, what's that exactly?
It involved assessing the quality of future events by comparing upcoming planetary configurations to those that happened during known past disasters. He wasn't predicting a specific event, more like saying, this alignment looks a bit like the one we had before the Great Fire of Rome, so maybe something bad like that could happen.
And we already established he wasn't necessarily great at the detailed calculations needed for that anyway.
Correct. Professional astrologers at the time actually criticized him for incompetence in exactly that area. But he needed the language of astrology to frame his predictions. The second, and probably most important source, was historical paraphrasing. Researchers have gone through his quatrains and found passages clearly lifted or closely adapted from classical historians. Livy, Plutarch, Suetonius, especially Suetonius's The 12 Caesars.
So Roman history was a big source.
Huge. And medieval chroniclers, too, like Jean Froissart. Even many of his astrological references seem to be taken almost word for word from a work by Richard Rousseau on astronomical cycles, published just a few years before in 1549-50. He was essentially building future anxieties out of past history.
Okay, so synthesizing history and astrology. What about the third source type, the more apocalyptic stuff?
Yes. This is where the core of his end times content comes from, anthologies and end time prophecies. His biggest single source, it seems, was the Mirabilis Liber, the wondrous book from 1522.
Mirabilis Liber.
It was a compilation, basically, of existing prophecies. It had work by figures like Pseudo-Methodius and the really fiery Florentine preacher Savonarola, and researchers have confirmed this Nostradamus' own preface to Les Prophéties. It contains 24 biblical quotes. Remarkably, all but 2 are used in the exact same order that Savonarola used them.
Wow. He didn't just borrow ideas. He borrowed the whole structure and rhythm.
Pretty much. He was repackaging these older prophecies, putting them into accessible French verse. Which is why, over time, people forgot the original sources and started crediting it all to him.
That's the real academic bombshell here, isn't it? The prophecy wasn't new, divine insight. It was more like a Renaissance-era mashup of existing texts, all rearranged and deliberately obscured. And to pull all this complex material together into thousands of verses, scholars suggest he might have used a specific technique. Bibliomancy.
Bibliomancy, yes. It's essentially divination by random access, using a book by chance. The method's simple. You randomly pick an existing book, history, prophecy, whatever, and you take inspiration or maybe a direct line from whatever page it happens to fall open at.
Like literary tarot cards.
Kind of. Given the sheer volume he produced and the the very patchwork nature of the content, where often in the same century he mixes references to classical figures like Sulla and Nero with vague stuff about battles in the clouds and unnamed king's bibliomancy. Seems like a pretty efficient, high-volume way to generate thousands of verses quickly, enough to meet his constant almanac and centuries deadlines.
It sounds almost like a cynical form of content generation, but you'd need a huge library for that.
And he had one. We know he owned a massive collection of books.
Okay, so despite building his entire later career on this, it's truly remarkable that Nostradamus himself explicitly rejected the label prophet. How did he square that circle?
He seemed pretty self-aware and probably also covering himself legally and professionally. In his preface to Caesar, which was addressed to his son, he stated quite clearly, "Although, my son, I have used the word prophet, I would not attribute to myself a title of such lofty sublimity."
He actually said that.
He did.
Yeah.
And again, in his letter to King Henry II, he said, "I in no way attribute to myself such a title here," explicitly. This denial was crucial, you see. He wasn't claiming divine foresight, which could bring the Inquisition knocking. He framed his method as more of an intellectual process, rooted in natural philosophy, mathematics, a sort of scientific, maybe flawed exercise in long-range judicial astrology, and recognizing historical patterns. He described his process as emptying my soul, mind, and heart of all care through mental calm and tranquility.
He also referenced the famous Greek Delphic rite, didn't he? The source of ancient prophecy. Was he trying to suggest he was doing ritual magic?
He often referenced the ancient Delphic rite, the image of the ancient prophetess receiving visions, but he almost always preceded these references with the phrase, "as though."
As though.
Yes, which strongly suggests he was invoking the image and the prestige of the ancient prophet, not literally claiming he was using supernatural fire or water gazing to get his visions. It was about branding again.
Before we move on to how everyone else misinterpreted his work, let's just quickly touch on his timeline. He claimed his prophecies extended from now 1555 to the year 3797.
That's a long time.
It is. And that date, 3797, is also quite telling because it seems to be sourced, not divinely revealed. If you subtract 1555, the year he wrote the preface, from 3797, what do you get?
2242.
Exactly. And 2242 was a date that had recently been proposed by Richard Rousseau, one of his main astrological sources, as a possible date for the end of the world, based on various calculations and planetary conjunctions. So even his most extreme timeline seems rooted in contemporary astrological speculation, not unique insight.
Okay, that brings us perfectly to section 3, the myth-making machine. We've established the source material is basically historical paraphrase, astrological speculation, generalized anxieties, not verifiable, date-specific predictions. And the actual content of the quatrains mostly deals with generalized disaster, right? Plagues, floods, invasions, war. Yes. And the major underlying theme, which is a direct reflection of the geopolitical reality of the 16th century, is this impending invasion of Europe by Muslim forces from the east and south, possibly headed by the Antichrist. This reflects the very real, very present threat posed by the Ottoman Empire's invasions at the time, which were pushing deep into Europe. The quatrains are like a mirror reflecting 16th century fear.
But of course, that vague content isn't why he's globally famous today. He's famous for the specific hits. The Great Fire of London, the French Revolution, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, maybe Princess Diana's death, 9/11.
And this is where the academic rebuttal is really crystal clear. These claims form what skeptics call a movable feast of predictions. Popular authors, the press, they retrospectively claim accuracy after the event. Post-diction, exactly. Fitting vague words to events that have already happened. The claims always follow the major event. They never precede it in any clear way. The classic example is the supposed prediction of Hitler. Often cited through verses that mention the word hister, or maybe similar spellings, the implication being, wow, he foresaw the name of the German dictator.
But as you pointed out earlier, Nostradamus was an educated guy using classical place names. And hister is just the classical Latin name for the lower Danube River, isn't it?
Precisely. He used classical names all the time. And some other verses supposedly predicting Napoleon feature the line, pau, ne, loron. Popular authors try to anagram that into Napoleon Roy, Napoleon King.
Right, I've heard that one.
But Pau, Ney, and Oleron are simply the names of 3 actual towns in southwestern France near where he lived. The words only seem to match when you force them through some really severe twisting of language or just bad translation.
And it was specific authors, people like Henry C. Roberts, Erica Cheatham later on, who really seized upon this vague text and actively manufactured these hits, often decades after the events happened. They were capitalizing on that human need to find patterns.
Exactly. Even documentary films like The Man Who Saw Tomorrow kind of played into this, suggesting vague future attacks on New York, for instance, but critically only after the fact, never specifying the World Trade Center or a date before 2001.
What's truly mind-blowing, though, is that this manipulation of the text wasn't just, sensationalist authors trying to sell books. It was actually formalized as state propaganda during World War II.
Oh, it's a remarkable historical episode, a case study in psychological warfare. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. He used Nostradamus as a tool for black propaganda, aimed at demoralizing people in the occupied territories.
Goebbels himself. How did that come about?
Apparently, he was introduced to the idea by his wife, Magda. He saw the psychological potential using an old, revered French figure against the French themselves. Goebbels actually documented it in his diary, early 1940. He wrote that he needed to set up an expert committee specifically to deal with Nostradamus, stating he needed to supply the necessary material for propaganda. So he hired a Swiss astrologer, Karl Ernst Kraft. Kraft had already got some notoriety because he'd allegedly correctly predicted an assassination attempt on Hitler back in 1939.
So the expert they hired already had some perceived credibility. That was probably key.
Yeah.
What did Kraft actually produce for Goebbels?
Kraft produced these propaganda booklets. They were filled with spurious and, in some cases, completely made-up verses, always framed to suggest an inevitable German victory. Then German planes airdropped these materials over Belgium and France during the Nazi invasion in May 1940. The goal was basically to tell the occupied populations, look, even your own greatest French prophet foresaw your defeat and our long reign.
That's chilling. Did Goebbels himself contribute?
He did. Goebbels personally wrote one completely fabricated passage that was inserted into these booklets. It claimed that war would rage until the people under the sign of the crooked cross. Pretty obvious who that meant would triumph for 1,000 years.
Wow. He didn't just twist existing text. He invented entirely new prophecy material to fit the narrative.
Exactly. Next-level media manipulation.
So the Allies must have noticed this. They couldn't just let Nazi propaganda using Nostradamus go unanswered, surely.
They didn't. The Allies quickly responded in kind. They started dropping their own counter-Nostradamus pamphlets over occupied Europe, translating and twisting the original quatrains to suggest Hitler's inevitable downfall.
A prophecy war.
Pretty much. And furthermore, MGM Studios in Hollywood made 4 short Nostradamus films specifically intended to boost American morale. They depicted his real prophecies as supporting the democratic cause. It just shows how widely recognized his name was and how easily his reputation could be hijacked for modern political aims.
We also need to quickly address the many, many myths, the apocryphal legends that persisted in popular books. These really fueled the idea that he was this mystical figure who must have been right about everything.
Yeah, modern academic research, especially since the 1980s, has pretty much debunked almost all of the really compelling biographical details that people thought were true. These claims, popularized especially by authors in the mid-20th century, included things like him being educated by his grandfathers, who were supposedly physicians to King Rene, or that he successfully earned a full medical doctorate, which we know isn't true.
Or the story about identifying a future pope.
Right, the spectacular feat of identifying the future Pope Sixtus V when he was just an unknown Franciscan monk by bowing before him. Great story, but none of these claims were backed up by any contemporary documents. They were based entirely on rumors, often spread centuries after he died. The idea he lectured at Montpellier, for instance, is completely contradicted by that expulsion document we talked about.
Okay, let's talk about the most famous legend of all. The one about his death and his grave.
Ah, yes. The famous story that his grave was disturbed during the French Revolution and they found a brass plaque on his chest that correctly stated the exact date of the exhumation, thereby cursing the grave diggers. It's entirely apocryphal.
It didn't happen.
Well, the legend existed much earlier. The English diarist Samuel Pepys recorded the specific legend in his famous diary way back in 1667. That's over a century before the French Revolution even happened. It was just a well-circulated, spooky story, not a verified event.
Okay, so this brings us to the final, really necessary academic critique, focusing on why the prophecies ultimately fail the test of verifiable prediction. You mentioned the publication of his private letters and original editions from the 1980s onwards, thanks to scholars like Comarat, Ben-Azra, Leroy. That really provided the ammo for the definitive modern skeptical argument, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. They uncovered key facts that directly contradicted the whole mythology. This led straight to the core skeptical argument, which people like James Randi famously championed.
Yeah.
That Nostradamus' reputation is entirely manufactured through post-diction, hindsight bias, essentially. The crucial, really undeniable point remains. No known quatrain has ever been successfully interpreted as predicting a specific event before it happened, other than in such vague, generalized terms that it could apply to dozens of different historical incidents.
Let's use that famous quatrain .35 as the definitive example, the one supposedly predicting King Henry II's death in that jousting tournament.
That's the perfect test case. The claim that quatrain 435 specifically predicted the king's death in 1559. Well, that interpretation didn't actually appear in print until 1614.
1614, that's 55 years after the event.
Exactly. 55 years later, the verse talks about two lions fighting, the younger one piercing the eye of the older one through a golden cage, which you could loosely fit to a shattered lance visor, sure, but the interpretation followed the tragedy. It absolutely did not precede it. Think about it. If the prediction had been known and understood beforehand, Nostradamus would likely have been treated as a true seer, maybe even warned the king. Instead, the prophecy was just retroactively fitted to the known facts long after everyone involved was dead.
And we see the same failure in his predictions that actually did have dates attached.
Yes.
Yes.
Quatrain the third, .77, is a great example. It predicts very specifically that in 1727 in October, the king of Persia shall be captured by those of Egypt. Did that happen?
No.
No. That specific event did not happen. Later interpreters tried to claim, retrospectively, that it represented a peace treaty signed between the Ottoman Empire and Persia in that year. Even though the literal capture he described never took place, the words had to be severely twisted, the specific details completely ignored, and the much-hyped 1999 prophecy in Quatrain X.72, equally useless. It describes a great king of terror coming from the sky. It describes no event that anyone successfully identified either before 1999 or since, unless you really torture the language.
And fueling all this misuse, all this post-addiction, is just the generally poor quality of the materials that most people encounter today, right? The translations.
That's a huge part of it. Academics who've studied this seriously note that almost all the popular English translations of Nostradamus' quatrains you find in bookshops today are, frankly, of extremely poor quality. They show very little genuine knowledge of 16th century French. And worse, they are often intentionally altered, words changed, phrases reordered specifically to make them fit whatever claimed event the translator is trying to prove. Fine, we need to be really clear about this. None of the major popular books that champion Nostradamus as a true prophet actually used the original historical editions of Le Prophétie. They were based on later, unreliable, and often deliberately manipulated translations. Translations that, for instance, might change a perfectly ordinary 16th century French word for, say, sailor, into a modern English equivalent that sounds like a specific naval commander's name, just to force a modern hit.
Okay, so if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, this deep dive really reveals that Nostradamus wasn't some supernatural prophet peering through time. He was, it sounds like, a very savvy, probably quite self-promoting 16th century author, a master synthesist who expertly borrowed from classical history, medieval sources, amplified the fears of his own time, like that Ottoman threat, and then deliberately obscured his work just enough to avoid trouble while keeping his patrons interested.
Precisely. He didn't really predict the future. He repurposed the past and expertly repackaged general historical anxiety. His work endures not because it's specific, but precisely because its calculated ambiguity allows it to reflect almost any future anxiety or any past tragedy. When a war starts, when a disaster strikes, someone can always go back and find a vague, rhyming couplet that seems to fit the description, more or less. The prophecies function like a Rorschach test, really, a mirror for the reader's own fears, beliefs, and their desire to find patterns. It proves the power of pattern recognition above all else.
It's the ultimate example of the human mind desperately trying to find order in chaos, isn't it?
Which raises, I think, a powerful final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. We established that Nostradamus himself stated his prophecies extended all the way out to the year 3797. And we also know his entire method relied heavily, almost exclusively, on historical texts and astrological ideas available in the 16th century stories of ancient Roman battles, medieval plagues, contemporary invasion fears. So if the actual basis of his prophecy is so rooted in the past, so limited to the knowledge available back in 1555, What does the continued success, the enduring fame of his prophecies really tell us? What does it say about that deep human need for pattern recognition, even when we're faced with overwhelming information suggesting the apparent patterns are purely coincidental, just random noise? It seems the allure of finding meaning in the chaos, of believing someone saw it coming, is often far more powerful than the facts themselves.